Awesome. Well, Joe, thank you so much for coming onto the channel. I'm really excited to be doing this collaboration video with you. Do you want to tell my subscribers a little bit about you and where they can find you on YouTube?
Hello, I'm Joe, and I'm well. You can type in Joe Webb. I do like writing stuff, like Claire does, on a YouTube channel of my own, and it's really good. Check it out if you want to.
What writing projects have you been involved in? What kind of stuff do you like to write?
Well, my favorite stuff to write is I had to really stop and think about it earlier because I was asked, "What do you write?" And I was like, "Fantasy. I like fantasy. Well, I like to write fantasy, folktale sort of stories. I like to write, the occasional horror." And there was another one, Bildungsroman.
Oh
Is
yeah,
that how you put that?
the coming of age stories, right?
Yeah. I'd never heard of that before, surprisingly, and I was like, "Oh, okay, that fits nicely." What about you? What sort of Well, I suppose everyone already knows what sort of stuff you write, don't they?
Yeah, I do talk about it quite frequently on this channel. I write young adult supernatural thrillers and mysteries. I love writing thrillers and about murder and supernatural. I always like to put a bit of a supernatural twist on my thrillers, just so I can broaden into like plot twists and things that I can do with the story that I can't necessarily do if it was a contemporary thriller. What age group do you like to write for? Do you like do more like adult fantasy or young adult fantasy, middle grade?
I don't know. I don't really have an age range in mind when I write. I just sort of write. I suppose I write for people like me. Hopefully, there's other people like me.
So to all of you who are watching, Joe and I made this list of questions that both we were able to take from our subscribers and questions that you have posed about writing or things that you've commented on our videos or things that you have commented on different community tab posts. And in this video, we're just kind of going to go through these questions and answer them in a very informal way. So part one of this video is going to be on my channel. We're going to go through about 10 questions, and part two of this video will be on Joe's channel. We're also going to go through about 10 questions. So to kick us off this evening, or this whenever you are watching this video, how do you start writing your books or stories? Do you want to kind of walk us through your origin process when you actually sit down to start writing?
Just today, actually, I put a video out saying what I'm going to do in the next few months on my channel, and I'm going to write a book, and I'm going to take everyone through the process, right, step by step. And I had to sit down and write out my process because I just do it anyway. But I thought I had to write it out so that I know what I'm doing. So literally, these will probably be my videos for the next few months, actually. I first do a mood board sort of thing where I kind of get the whole style and I make it look, I make it look how I want it to look and get the whole vibe of the story, and then I write a few demo scenes. It doesn't necessarily mean that these are the scenes that I would put in the story. It's just anything that comes to mind. I'm like, I'm just going to write a little short scene, see how it turns out. And then after that, I sort of go on and just brainstorm, literally just brainstorm until I have the entire plot, most of the plot sorted out, and I know what's going on.
Do you have a
Then I go,
method that you like to use for like plotting your book? Like, do you have a structure that you like to use? Do you have some sort of way that you like to figure out the plot? Like, I know some writers will like figure out the climax of the book first, or they'll figure out the theme and then figure out the inciting incident and the climax. Do you have a sort of process?
yeah, well, after I've done all the brainstorming and all that, and I know what my plot's about, then I'll usually structure it with the 3-act structure. What about you?
Yeah, well, I typically start by outline. I'm a big plotter, so I like to start by actually sitting down to outline the book. I don't like putting any fingers to keyboard, pen to paper until I've figured out every single detail of the book, because I feel that I'm able to jump forward and skip some steps in my writing process by figuring out all of the details of the book ahead of time. I know that for a lot of writers, this kills the joy that they have for writing if people like lean more towards the pantsing side, but I don't like to write unless I know where I'm going next. So because plotters and pantsers exist on this spectrum, I definitely lean more toward plotter, the plotter end of that spectrum. I use an outlining method called plot grids, where I will sit down in Excel and make, I think it's one row corresponding to every chapter and one column corresponding to like every main plot and subplot and chapter number. So I'm able to see in like a spreadsheet form the big picture of the book and how all of the subplots need to develop. And so I fill that out to the best of my ability before starting to write the first draft. And by around like the 3/4 mark of the book, I will usually stop writing the first draft because I will have deviated so far from the outline that my climax no longer makes sense. And then I'll have to go back and rework everything and fix stuff. And then I will fix it for the second draft. And then usually at the end of my second draft process is when I ask beta readers to take a look and my developmental editor to take a look. And then I will take that feedback and use that to guide the writing of the third draft. But to actually start, I just sit down and outline because I find that is the most effective way for me to get all of my ideas together.
Do you sort of outline as you think of the plot, or do you have the whole plot? Like, do you know exactly what you're doing before you start outlining and structuring it?
I usually think of plot as I'm outlining. I will have a vague idea of what I want the story to be, but I have to figure out all of the story questions. So I know, like, I have to figure out how they get, like, they start here and they end here, but I don't know how they get there. So I have to go and like sit down and brainstorm and try to come up with a bunch of different ideas to make it make sense and give them a way that they can get to point B. Sometimes I will know where like some of the events in the middle, but a lot of it is just sitting down and trying to brainstorm and think through it. So the second question that we have is, what are your favorite genres to read versus favorite genres to write?
Can I say what are my favorite genres to watch instead?
Yeah.
Because I think I
mean, if you want to disappoint your subscribers, I mean, by not answering their question.
I'll say both. I'll say both because I watch more TV and film probably than books than I read books, you know. I'll start with books. Let me show you actually. Have you ever heard of Enid? Well, you have heard of Enid Blyton, but have you ever read any of their books?
I think that's like Magic Faraway Tree, right?
Yeah, that's right. Yeah. Magic Faraway Tree. Got Brer Rabbit. These are all the books on the back of my table. So these are like the biggest. These are the biggest stories that I love to read. Those sort of magical, almost child stories. You ever heard? Well, have you heard of Where the Wild Things Are? Yeah, love that as well. I don't know what genre that is. What would you say that is? Where the Wild Things Are.
I mean, that's a children's book, right? That's is that?
Yeah. Maybe children's books. Maybe that's my favorite.
I think the Magic Faraway Tree is middle grade though, because it's chapters. If I'm right, it's been ages since I've read it, but I'm pretty sure that's like a middle grade fantasy, maybe. But I'm pretty sure Where the Wild Things Are is a children's book. I mean, is it a chapter book? I haven't read it in such a long time. I just remember the illustrations really vividly.
Yeah, maybe my favorite books are children's books. Another one is Daniel Morden. These are a bit more grown up. They're quite dark. Again, the same sort of vibe as the Magical Faraway Tree, but a bit more grown up. Yeah. But in terms of like TV shows and films, I love a good comedy. What about you? What are your favorites? You said yours is like crime and thriller and stuff?
Yeah, I read a lot of young adult thrillers because that's what I write. So I read lots of like horror, thriller, crime. And then usually I'm a little bit too scared to watch like Criminal Minds type TV shows because they just like really get my heart pounding and adrenaline running, and it's just like a little bit too much for me. So I will usually default to comedies on TV or documentaries, like true crime documentaries that aren't like crime done in a fictional way for the drama element, because that's like Criminal Minds is so effective at what it does. It's just a little bit too intense for me. But I definitely try to read what I write most of the time.
Do you find that nowadays, I don't know about you, but nowadays I watch way more comedy than I used to. I don't know if it's just because the state of, everything going on out there, I feel a bit like I need a bit more sort of lighthearted stuff.
Yeah, I've been rewatching a lot of my favorites as in terms of comedy shows. Like I've been rewatching Schitt's Creek and Parks and Rec and all of those. Because they're just like, they give me so much comfort and they make me really happy. So I think that that's another thing. I read sometime, or like someplace, somewhere, that it's like a not a symptom, but like it's something that people with a lot of anxiety do, is like rewatch like
Yeah.
shows that they've seen before, because it's like it's comforting to know what's going to happen next, and it's not.
Mhm.
I don't know, but
I can't believe you said Schitt's Creek and Parks and Recreation. Those are like such good shows.
I mean, I think it's really important to read outside of the genre that you write in, not to only read what you write. So that's why I do try to push myself to read other. I mean, I usually stick to young adult, but I'll read other genres of young adult because I think that a lot can be learned from other genres as well.
Mhm.
So our third question that we got is, what do you think is the best form to tell a story? Novels, movies, poems?
I don't think that there's a best form.
Mhm.
I think it's probably all preference.
Yeah, I agree. And also the story that you want to tell. I think that there are certain stories that cannot be told in some of these mediums. Like I think that there are some poems that can't be told in a novel form. And like, you know, because a story in a poem is so much smaller than a story in a novel. And I was listening to a talk actually just earlier today that said that movies are really like short stories, like a whole script really is only about 20,000 words, and like you cannot cover the same depth and amount of information that you can in a novel as you can in a movie. So you really just have to kind of keep the focus of your movie a lot more narrow than you have to when you're writing a novel. So that's why I think like a lot of movie adaptations of books can't go into the same depth that the books can. And I think it really depends on the story that you want to tell.
Yeah, I have nothing to add to that. Absolutely.
Or like short stories, like you have to kind of, a short story focuses more on like one moment of change in a character's life, whereas a novel you can really like take them through, like they start as this person and then they go defeat this big bad at the end of the novel. You can really like take them through a whole journey, whereas you can still take them through a whole journey on a short story, but it's going to be a much smaller scale journey. They're not going to like go from humble farm boy to defeating the ancient magical wizard by the end of your short story.
I found it really hard when I used to do videos where I would like make up a little story to demonstrate a technique that I was talking about. Sometimes I found it really hard because there's just not enough time to do it in a short story.
Yeah.
But other things, it's perfect because you don't need any more time.
Right.
Like TV shows are great for really long, in-depth character, development, all that sort of stuff. Yeah, I took the words out of my mouth, really.
So then moving on to our next question, what is more important, the story or the way that you present it?
Oh, I was thinking of a different answer, but I think I'm gonna go with writing style.
Really?
Probably. Yeah, I was gonna say the other one.
Why?
But,
Because I disagree with you.
really? Ooh. I feel like you can have a really good story, but if it's not told in a good way, if it's not told in a unique way, then it can really lose its impact. But you can have a not very good story or a sort of average story, but if your style is really unique and really captivating, if the words that you use are really, captivating, then I feel like the story doesn't matter as much because the way that it's told, or even like in films, visually, a nice shot, really nice style can really, really outshine an average story, I think.
I think that we need to figure out what we're talking about by story or style. By style, like I was thinking more like style meant prose, not necessarily story structure. And then story was like plot, including story structure. So I would say like being able to tell a really good story and plot it out in a way that keeps your readers engaged is more important than the actual words that you use to tell that story with, as long as we're talking about novels, because I am more familiar with that than films. I would say that that's more important, just because, readers read in order to get invested in the characters, to go experience other things, to, I don't know, I've never picked up a book because I've wanted to read nice prose. And the way that I've focused my growth as a writer is like, how can I write prose that blends into the background as much as I can so that the readers can just get pulled into the story. But I agree with you if you group story structure in with style, because I think that you can tell like if you deliver an average story well in a way that like the audience can really connect to and go along with, then I think that it's good. But I don't know. I think that you can tell a really, really great story with prose that is not very exciting.
Yeah, no,
It
really
depends on
define.
the way that you define it.
Yeah.
So our next question is, how do you remain consistent with writing? Do you have any unique ways to stay inspired and motivated?
Oh, that's so relevant to me right now because the past few weeks, I've had a little dip in motivation to write, and my inspiration to write just sort of plummeted. And I had to really, really properly think about it. I suppose it depends on what you're writing for, maybe, because if you're writing professionally, then um, you kind of have to just keep going, even if you're not motivated or inspired, you know. But if you're just writing for fun, then perhaps you have more time to sort of play around with it and get in the zone properly, and you can sort of get yourself in the zone, and you have time to sort of wait. So because I write more for fun at the moment, then the way I sort of get myself motivated to do it, I just go for a walk. And either I'll go for a walk and I'll sort of just, as I go for a walk, my mind just wanders. And if I'm not in the zone at the moment, then by the time I come back from a walk, I'm all up here, and I'm just ready to write just something.
Yeah, I have a little bit more of a just sit your butt down in the chair and do it approach to that. I write every day, and like even on days that I don't feel like doing it, I force myself to sit down and do it anyway. And I find that the routine and the consistency really helps me. And if I am not feeling like I want to write that day, I sit down and I kind of do some critical analysis, like what is it that is making me feel this way? What is it about this story that is making me feel this way? Is there a problem that I need to think through? And if there is a problem that I can identify, I sit down and I like reason my way through it in the moment so that I'm able to overcome the writer's block as fast as I can. But yeah, I don't really have any unique ways that I stay inspired because I love writing, and it's all I think about all the time. So I really feel driven to do it all the time. There are days that I don't want to because I'm like, oh, this is going to be a hard scene to write. Oh, I'm really tired today. My brain is just not having it. But I find that really being, I don't want to say really being aggressive with it and like sitting down and forcing yourself to do it is the best thing to do, but it's what works for me. And trying to do a little bit every day if you can and not miss days helps. But I also do this professionally. I don't do this as a hobby. So I think that also might have something to do with it. I think if I were doing it as a hobby, motivation and inspiration might come into play a little bit more, but I don't really give myself any excuses the way that I'm writing now.
What do you think causes someone to lose inspiration or to lose motivation to write, even when they love it, even when they have loved it for years?
That's a very, very good question. I think in my opinion, at least how it's happened for me is that I typically lose the motivation to write or lose the inspiration when I am encountering a problem or when I think it's going to be hard. And I have a bit of a childlike tantrum in my head where I don't want to do this. I don't want to sit down and figure this out. I would just rather watch television and film TikToks and not have to actually sit down and fix my problem. So I think that is part of it. I think writing a story that you don't absolutely love can be part of it. I can never write short stories. I never want to write short stories. It's always a struggle to force myself to finish short stories that I start. But with novels, it's like a puzzle that I just cannot stop thinking about. I get so invested in the characters and the story, and I just want to be with that all of the time. So I think that you could lose inspiration if you don't love what you're writing. I think you can lose inspiration if you are encountering a problem. But if you're encountering a problem, that is in a way a good thing because you can identify the problem and sit down and fix it and then regain your inspiration. But yeah, that's been my experience. What about yours?
I find I'm going to have to think about that a lot, actually, what you just said. I recently sort of thought, I remembered back to when I used to write a lot of film scripts. I used to love movie making more so than books. I mean, it's kind of changed now. But yeah, I got into writing when I loved movie making and stuff with my little camera. And I wanted to write film scripts and make films. And when I realized it's not going to happen, I'm not going to be able to make a film right now, I kind of lost the passion for writing. I haven't written a film script since, actually. And it kind of changed the medium changed a little bit, but that's how I lost my passion for writing scripts. But for other types of stories, I don't know, but I've just rekindled my passion for things. I have yet to figure out why exactly.
I think having writing goals that you like, having defined goals for writing and understanding why you set those goals and why you want to achieve those things can also really help you keep the motivation to write. Because if you want to write and publish a book, you need to finish your book. Like that, you know, if that is something that you really want and you understand why you want it and it's really deeply important to you, you're not going to be able to achieve it unless you put your butt in the chair and do it. So I think that also might be helpful, because then like you have a very, very concrete goal that you're working toward, and you can see in concrete steps what you need to do in order to achieve it. And if you don't really want it, then, you know, it's easy to lose inspiration and motivation. Like you have to really, really want it. But I think that if you do and you find a goal that you are really passionate and connected to, that can definitely help. So moving on to our next question, we have somebody that would like to know the formula for creating novels that are page turners and that keep readers up late at night, unable to put your book down. Do you have any tips for writing books like this?
Do you have something to say to that?
I would say having a cause and effect plot would be very helpful. So if you have, you know, an overarching goal that your protagonist wants to achieve, I think that having, you know, your character does one thing, which causes this to happen, which does this to your character, which causes your character to do this thing, and have all of the things be interconnected so that your readers are always on the edge of their seats. Like, what is this going to do? How is this going to affect the character? What is going to happen next? I think that is helpful. I think treating every single individual chapter as almost like having its own arc, like you would in a book. Like you have kind of an opening, and then you have a climax of the chapter, and then a resolution and a cliffhanger right on the end of the chapter, pushing them into the next chapter, could be really good. I think having lots of reversals of expectation throughout the book can be helpful for this. Like if you think the book is going one way, but then it actually twists and goes into a different way, and then it twists and goes into a different way, so your readers don't know what's going to be the end resolution of the book. I think that can also be helpful for keeping them turning the pages. I think that really maybe most importantly is having a character that your readers can relate to and connect to, because your characters are the vehicle through which you bring your readers into the story. So if you have a really, really personable character who people can really attach themselves to, it's going to make them feel more like the effects of the story are happening to them and make them more emotionally impacted by the story. So if you have this crazy threat to your character, then they're going to want to find out what happens to that character more, because they are more connected to that character.
Do you feel like the experience is more important to get people invested in, or do you feel like the sort of the mental putting the puzzle pieces together, what's going on, is more important, or do you think they're as equal?
I think that they're both important. I think you definitely need your readers to be invested, because it's not going to matter whether you have all of these puzzle pieces to put together if your readers aren't invested, because they're not going to want to put the puzzle pieces together. I think having puzzle pieces for your readers to put together is very important when you're writing, especially like mysteries and thrillers, because you don't want your plot twist to come completely out of left field. You want the clues to have been there the whole time, because then it's going to make really, really savvy readers feel very satisfied when they were able to guess it right. And other readers, when the plot twist happens, be able to look back and be like, oh, I can't believe that I didn't see that coming. So I think that you need them both, but I don't think that you can really have that page turning effect unless you have both of those things.
I was thinking, well, my answer as you were talking was to make sure that the story just keeps on moving forward. Like it, so long as it's well structured and you know, like you can point to every single plot point in the story, and you spend the necessary amount of time on that plot point to get from, so the story moves from there to there. And then when it gets to there, personally, I would want to just work on the next event to get from there to there, and just keep it moving forward rather than sort of getting stagnated in explaining, I don't know, the environment, explaining anything that doesn't really need to be explained. Just
Definitely.
keep things moving forward, and also good mystery.
Yeah, well, I think that definitely keeping your chapters short can also help. I also think having the stakes become consistently higher and like the potential outcome become consistently worse can also help. So like it was going to be bad at the beginning, but then like, you know, in the next scene, oh my God, it's going to get worse by the halfway mark. Like they're going to lose everything, you know, like it keeps getting worse and it keeps looking like maybe they're not going to win more. So then people will become more invested because, you know, the stakes are higher, they're going to lose more, the outcome is not looking great, but there's still hope that they'll be able to pull it off. So definitely ratcheting up the tension as the book goes and also ratcheting up the pace as the book goes can help. So our next question is also kind of along these lines. It's about pacing. So the question is, what if the stories are more exciting in your head than they are on paper? What do you do to fix that?
So I really like to make music, and for years I've wanted to make to make really nice songs. I can play a bit of guitar, but that's not all that's needed. Unfortunately, I need to know how to use the software, how to record it, because you can be good at guitar, but you might not have a good, you might not know how to record it properly and how to put in the software and mix in the drums and all the stuff. But then you have to master it so all the sounds pop. You get all the nice proper sounds so it's not a sort of muffled mess. And unfortunately, I don't know how to do any of that. So even though in my head I can hear really nice music and really nice songs, and I think that would be lovely. I wish I could make that. I have the creativity to do it, and I can hear it. I just don't necessarily. I even have the resources, like I have the really nice microphone and I have the software. I just don't know how to use it. So to put it in, to sort of, I don't know, to switch over to writing, I would maybe say you might have a really nice scene in your head, or you might have a whole plot or a nice mystery, and you might have a pen and paper or Microsoft Word on your document, and you might know how to write English, or you might have good grammar and stuff, but maybe you just don't really have the skills and practice of, say, taking that idea and taking it and sort of making some sort of order out of the chaos in your head and structuring it so that it flows nicely. Or maybe the vocabulary, maybe it's really nice up here, but you don't have the creative vocabulary to write it in a way that sort of conveys how it is up here. I don't know, I feel like I'm just rambling, but I feel like that was a good answer. What do you think?
Yeah, well, I think that very much encapsulates what the person who posed the question is feeling. I think that it's definitely a relatable feeling. I have felt this way before because, as readers, because most writers are readers also, and as readers, we know what a good book is. We know what a good book looks like. We know the sorts of things that we enjoy in fiction, and we can be extremely creative with the ideas that we come up with. However, if we haven't been writing for a long time, sometimes our technical abilities will not allow us to create the kind of ideas that we have in our head. Like we can picture it as a finished story, but we don't know how to execute it in the way that we want to. And so really the practical advice that I would give you is to just continue learning about craft and to try your best writing the story to the best of your ability now. Even if it's going to fall short from, the exciting idea that you have in your head about this story, you are going to learn a lot from writing it, getting feedback on it, revising it, trying it again, getting more feedback, revising it, and trying it again. That's what I did when I had an idea like this. And it really, really helped me grow as a writer. The story ended up not being, an amazing, completely revolutionary story, but I learned a lot about point of view and about different narrative timelines and about voice and all of that important stuff through actually sitting down and trying to write that story. So don't let your fear that your technical abilities are not at the same level as your creativity stop you from writing, because the only way that your technical abilities are going to get better is if you try to write that story. So Yeah, that's what I would do. Our next question is, how do you write exposition without it sounding tacked on or boring? Should it be pushed into dialogue, or should you have whole separate scenes dedicated to exposition?
Well, the way I go about it, whether this is right or not, I don't know, but the way I go about it is having a character need to know something, and so a lot of the time you can just you just explain it to the audience because the audience needs to know. But if a character also needs to know, then you can have another character explain it to them. And I know that sounds really kind of obvious and maybe amateur, I don't know, but that's just how I do. I remember watching TV shows or reading books and just thinking they've done this really well. Like how we're learning about this character from this other character, knowing nothing about them but wanting to know, or like needing to know, or else if they don't know, oh my god, I'm going to die. Tell me what's going on.
Yeah, I definitely think creating whole scenes dedicated to exposition is not the way to go. I think also trying to info dump in whole paragraphs is also not the way to go. I did this a lot in the book that I published in high school. I would like have whole paragraphs dedicated just to explaining the world. And in hindsight, I really wish that I hadn't done that. I think that one really great way to do exposition is to just weave it into the small details. You can signal to readers what kind of world it's going to be with like one sentence descriptions of certain things. Like, I don't know, let's say that you are writing a historical fiction book set in New York in the 1930s. Like, you can have advertisements that would have been placed around New York in the 30s. You can have products be mentioned by your characters just offhandedly, and that will immediately signal to the reader, okay, that's not something that we use right now. That's a little bit different. Like, they might not know exactly the year that the story is set in, but you don't need to say that right off the bat. You can drop in little tiny details in character action to help build your world and your exposition. I think that trying to carry on with as little explaining as you possibly can is good, and really just trying to throw your readers into the story as fast as possible. Like, if a character is going to meet somebody else and it's their best friend, that character shouldn't come up and be like, hey, best friend, like, we've been friends since we were 7. Like, that's not what you need. Like, but the familiarity between the two characters is going to signal to readers, okay, these people are friends. They'll be able to talk about things that aren't like info dumpy, but are, you know, if let's say the friend has a crush on the main character's sister, they don't have to be like, you know, XYZ has a crush on my sister, but the other person can be like, oh, did you see what your sister was wearing? And then they can be like, don't you ever talk about my sister? Like, you know, these are terrible examples, but you can really show that through the character interactions if it's really important. And if it's not important, then you shouldn't show it. Really, all that you need to do as far as world building goes, if you're writing a dystopian world, I mean, this can get a little bit more complicated because you need to show, like, you know, what is different about your dystopian world compared to the normal world. But you don't need to go through the entire history of, like, you know, of the past 500 years, how that world became or came to be. So I think trying to limit exposition as much as possible. Sorry, I know that was a little bit rambly, but trying to limit it as much as possible. Use as much, or like do it in dialogue, but keep the dialogue really, really natural sounding. And remember that your readers are very clever, and your readers are going to be able to pick it up. You don't need to hit them over the head with details over and over and over again in a very explicit way. You can make it very subtle, and I think your readers are still going to pick up on it.
And maybe go into your favorite story or something and read the first few pages, because in the first part of the story, especially if it's a good story that you really like, these are books that probably do exposition really well. So just read it and see what they do, and see if you can pick up on it and imitate it. I feel like exposition is very sort of stylistic.
Yeah, and you really, like, in a lot of cases, you don't need a lot. Like, it really depends on the genre. Like, if you're writing contemporary fiction, you don't need really very much exposition at all, unless you need to know, like, history between two characters. But like, you don't really need very much world building. I think, like, if you have a very complicated world and, like, you know, a dragon walks into the scene, you know, and that dragon is really important and there are certain rules about dragons, then you might need a little bit of explanation, but you probably shouldn't go like more than a couple of sentences, because otherwise people will start getting bored. So is like, instead of spending 2 sentences saying, like, you know, in our town, we ride dragons, blah, blah, blah. We started doing this ever since, this person once rode a dragon, like, tens of thousands of years ago. You can just show the character riding a dragon and people will pick up the ride dragons in the town. So try to keep it as active as possible for sure. So our second to last question is, how do you build up a story with interesting mind games that are actually not mindless? Like, I think there are a lot of authors that use luck as a factor in plotting, like characters happen to be at the right place at the right time and discover a really crucial element to the story or the mystery. How do you keep or build a plot that continues moving forward without using and relying on luck, and instead relying on the character's intelligence and problem solving ability?
I don't know. Do you have an answer for that?
Yeah, I think that this would also go back to talking about cause and effect plots. So instead of relying on luck, you make sure that like everything that happens in your mystery is a reaction to like something that your characters are doing. So if it's like, a teenage sleuth who is going to try to solve a crime, that teenage sleuth talks to somebody who ends up doing this, which ends up betraying that piece of information, which allows the sleuth to go do this, which causes this thing to happen. So like everything has a very clear cause and a very clear effect that pushes the story forward. So being very, very careful about, making sure that your characters are doing stuff that actually gets them to the climax. I know that I've been guilty of using the luck thing like in one or two scenes before. Like if, I'm like, oh, how are they gonna because a lot of times authors will also do that to speed up the plot a little bit. Like they could jump through all of these hoops to get here, but it's going to take up like 15,000 words. So let's just have this happen or have this person happen to show up just at that exact moment. And then they can just kind of take off running with it. I definitely don't recommend it. I don't think, but having it happen occasionally is okay. But yeah, I think mind games are tricky because you as the author need to be very clever and you need to be very conscious of what your readers are thinking as they're reading and like how you are playing with their expectations. So I think that like beta readers and critique partners and people who can give you feedback on like the reading experience of your book can be helpful for plotting those. It really depends on your idea of what the mind game is. I think that something that could help you do this is like starting with your villain and really thinking about what the villain wants, what the villain is doing, and plot out what your villain is going to do throughout the entire book before layering on top what your hero is going to do to try to counter them. So you always know what your villain is doing at every single stage, and you can drop clues to what your villain is doing throughout every single stage, but your hero just doesn't know about it. I think that can help. Yeah, I don't know. I think that would be my take on it at first look.
As you were talking about there, you gave me a really good idea. And funnily enough, this is something I thought about 2 weeks ago or something. And I'm going to need to go get something from my kitchen to show you. I'll ignore the mind games bit because I'm not really too familiar with like writing mind games and stuff. Mm-hmm. But I would just say that because I do this sometimes, if I notice that like, oh, something just happens by chance or something seems like, oh, that's a bit lucky, isn't it? Matter of fact, someone's story that I was sort of like I was helping them with their story and I thought, this bit seems a bit lucky. That's a little bit too lucky. Maybe we can make that a little bit more, well, less luck and more by, less by chance and more, well, you know what I'm trying to say. And what it was someone's falling in a river and they're drowning, and then a boat comes and saves them. And I thought, well, that's very, very lucky that came out of nowhere. And it made me do this. I'll explain this in a minute. I'll explain it now, actually. It's just this. I did this so that I didn't forget. I'm not going to keep it like this. Let's say this is your story, right? This is your story. And if you spot something that, let's say this is the bit that's, or here's the thing that's a little bit too lucky, and it kind of comes out of nowhere. This is the start. start, middle, end. And you notice, oh, this bit's a little bit too lucky. Everything that happens in a story has a start, middle, and end as well, not just the entire plot. And I pretend there's no hole there. Fold a story, poke a little hole in it, and then when you take it out, this little boat thing here, when this boat comes and saves this person, this has had a direct impact on your story, and you can set it up in the past here, almost like like a little wormhole in space where it kind of like folds in on itself. And this was just, it might be a little bit of a silly way to remember it, but I always just thought if something's a little bit too lucky or a little bit too by chance, you don't necessarily have to change it, but set it up beforehand.
Yeah.
So you can see that boat, there's just at the start of the scene, there's just a boat doing something. And so that even when the boat comes along, it's not just completely out of nowhere. It was there before. And I'm like, oh, I see. That's very, very, okay. Does that make sense?
Absolutely.
That's my first time explaining that ever. So that might have been a bit long.
No, that makes perfect sense. And that is very helpful. That's a cool way to think about it. As you started, I was like, what is this paper? But like, no, I understand. I've seen like a lot of movies where, like you'll see like one detail toward the beginning and you're not going to think it's that important. And then later, like that ends up being important or coming in and saving the day or interacting with the cast in some way. And you're like, oh, I remember that person, or like that taxi driver from the beginning. And like, it all kind of puts the pieces together. So that's a good way to think about it. You should absolutely set up anything like that before it happens.
Literally just showing it. You ever seen Shaun of the Dead?
No.
Where right at the end they're in this pub, there's loads of zombies coming in, and luckily enough there's a gun right behind them to save the day. And had they not shown that at the start of the film, we would all be thinking, fat lot of luck that was, that was very, very lucky. But because we knew it was there and we saw it earlier, we're like, oh, that was clever.
Right.
Yeah.
No, absolutely. And then, so just moving this and wrapping it up, because we've been going for a while now.
I know, I just need time. It wasn't meant to go this long.
I know. How do you like to edit your writing projects? What does your process look like? Do you have a method?
I don't know, really. Probably, what would you say actually first? What would you say?
Well, usually what I do is after I finish my first draft, I step away from it for about a week to 2 weeks. Because when you have a little bit of space from a project, you're able to see it a lot more clearly. Then after I do that, I usually don't sit down and read it all the way through because it's a little bit too cringy and embarrassing. Like I don't get a lot of stuff out of doing that. And I usually already have a list of things that I know that I want to fix that I've noted down as I was writing book one. And usually I will end my draft one right before the climax. So I will already understand why I couldn't write the climax and all the stuff that I have to redo. So I will sit down and I'll redo an outline in Excel. I'll do like a full plot grid on grid software that I use. And I will break down the book and I will color code it. So I have everything that has already been written in black and everything that I want to add in green. And then I will go back through the book chapter by chapter and have it fit that outline that I've created for draft 2. And then for draft 3, it really depends because after draft 2, I go get feedback on the book and kind of get an idea of how I'm going to improve. And then I take the feedback that I've gotten and then make a unique strategy for draft 3.
Yeah, that was very thorough. I don't know how I would explain how I edit stories. I would, when I have the whole story, I will usually have plotted out and put it into the structure that I want it. And because I usually write the 3-act structure, kind of like a little combined version of that and the hero's journey, then I might read through it and or the chapters, and I'll sort of take out those parts and say that's this bit of the structure, and this is the purpose of this scene, and then this is the purpose of this scene, and that's the purpose of that scene. And if any bit sort of I can't really say, maybe I could take that out. Maybe this doesn't have much of a purpose in the story. I don't know. Then I'll either think that through, or I'll just take it out. But something, this might sound a bit daft, but this is more the words rather than the plot. It might sound a bit daft, but sometimes I take what I've written and I put it in like a text-to-speech software, and I have it play back to me, and I just hear how it sounds, because sometimes it sounds different to when I read it. And I hear it and I go, oh, that would sound better if I write it this way instead. I even do that when like writing emails sometimes. You know, when you hear it, you can hear if something doesn't really flow nicely, or if a sentence isn't clear, you know?
Yeah, that's super helpful for writing prose for sure. And editing your writing. I do that like closer right before. That's kind of like my final stage, is that I will do that like, but for the whole book, kind of right before publication, because you can also catch typos that way. So I will do that right at the end, but that's after I've done line editing, after I've done everything, is like a final pass through to make sure everything flows right. So Joe, thank you so much for joining me today and answering these questions. For everybody who would like to continue listening to us talk about or answer questions from you all, we are doing a part 2 of this video on Joe's channel. So head on over to that if you're interested in watching it. I will have the link to his channel in the description. And thank you all for watching.
Thank you. Bye.